Public dialogue and civic engagement are important. They play a role in improving the health and well-being of Texans across our great state. That's why Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas is proud to support Texas Tribune conversations like the one you're about to see.
Please join me in welcoming Derek Cohen, Joe Moody, Douglas Smith, and James White. So grateful to all of you for being here. So many topics we can talk about under the very broad heading of criminal justice policy, but the one that is in the news today and has been in the news a lot since the beginning of this calendar year is guns and gun violence. That's part of the topic of criminal justice, surely. I was interested to learn, sad to learn, but interested to learn, that there has been more than one mass shooting per day around this country in 2015. On the day of the shooting in Oregon, it was the 275th day of the year, and it was the 294th mass shooting in this country. Now, we're a state that believes in the Second Amendment. We passed open and campus carry laws this legislative session, soon to take effect, January and August, respectively. We'll talk about that in a second. There have been more than 31,000 gun deaths, or gun-related deaths, in this country this year. I wonder, where does this conversation in a state like Texas, Representative White, where does this conversation go over the next 5 years? How should Texas be thinking about those facts and the politics and the culture of this state? Where do those things intersect?
Thank you very much for that question, Evan. And I think we start from a basic premise. Obviously, we have the Second Amendment, which guarantees this right to all American citizens, and we have a similar amendment in our state constitution. But at the same time, society has the right to require a level of responsibility from the broader society and from individuals. When you look at these incidents of mass shootings, especially some of the spectacular ones, and as we move forward 5 years, I think we need to look at the intersection of mental health and how that is impacting our society.
Yep.
Legislatively, we look at this issue every session, and we see where we are drastically behind in treatment. Just in East Texas, talking to sheriffs and police officers on the street, they'll tell you the dire circumstances we're in dealing with this issue of mental health. So moving the next 5 years is, how do we address effectively and efficiently this issue of mental health?
Mr. Cohen, Representative White, Vice Chairman White is correct that this state is a Second Amendment state. People in this state believe that the Second Amendment gives them the protections that they need to carry and to use guns where they feel they need to protect themselves. You hear a lot about good guys with guns and bad guys with guns, and the differences there. But the nation's attention at a moment like this turns to whether legislatively we should be doing something to better protect ourselves. And it seems like a conversation we have over and over. The president, in fact, acknowledged the other day how many times I've been up here to make the same kind of statement over this calendar year. From your perspective, is Representative White characterizing the situation correctly?
Certainly, I would actually agree wholeheartedly with Representative White, and I also would say it's not exactly a surprise that Barack Obama wants to get in front of a camera to push a gun control agenda. I would also say that separating the politics from this issue is the important thing. Let's take a look at the grander picture here. When we're talking about mass shootings, if you're depending on who you're actually looking at that's aggregating this, we're talking about shootings with 3 or more victims. So a lot of these are not these ones that are covered in the news. They're the ones that you're seeing in inner city Chicago. You're seeing them in New York. You're seeing them in these places of high frequency, dense gun violence to begin with. The idea of whether or not this should circumscribe a Second Amendment right is really neither here nor there. I would underscore what Representative White said as far as requiring a modicum of responsibility, requiring certain mental health check boxes requirements be met. But I think we're losing part of the bigger picture here, that gun violence as a whole, as an aggregate phenomenon, has been going down. If we look at violent crimes and homicides as a whole, they've been going down. And again, whether or not that's because of chicanery and the measurement, you can't do that in the aggregate. But when it comes to on the certain aspect of reporting, yes, you can do a little bit of behind the baseball there. I think more importantly, though, is that we need to keep in perspective that we are talking about a certain fringe criminal here. We're not even talking about the criminals that really make up the bulk of our criminal justice system currently.
So you'd say, Mr. Cohen, looking out for the next 5 years in Texas, there is no legislation, no changes to policy that you think we need to contemplate to try to get out ahead of this issue?
I think that we could do so, but doing so would only be trying to engage in hollow self-assurance.
Representative Moody, you know that the state legislature this year passed open carry legislation. Texas was famously one of only 6 states that did not permit licensed open carry in the country. For goodness sakes, Massachusetts allowed open carry and Texas did not. Hard to believe, but now we have open carry coming as of January 1st around the state of Texas. Do you think that the numbers of mass shootings around the country give you any more pause than during the legislative session about whether this is a good idea or a bad idea?
I think it's something you should always, you need to take those things into account. I think when you try to define mass shootings, it doesn't make them less egregious because it's 3 or more in inner cities. So we need to be careful about, there's still violent crimes that we need to address. Legal gun ownership versus illegal gun ownership. So those are the things we need to start to kind of crop out. How do we do anything about that? What does the state get involved in? First of all, I'd like to encourage, and I don't know what's going on this campus, but campus carry was passed this legislative session. I voted against that, but there's a component of that legislation that was placed in the bill to allow your campus to have a say-so in where you think guns should be prohibited based on the nature of your campus, the type of facilities you have. I would encourage you to get involved in that process and make sure that your campus is reflective of your values. That was built into the bill to give some local control, even though there was widespread opposition by most campuses that I heard from. But if you look at the constitutional construct we have to work under, how can we regulate within the Second Amendment? You can regulate who can get weapons, that's your background checks, where they can go with those weapons, so restrictions on place that you can go with them, and what kind of weapons. So those are the arenas that we have to look at. So when we're talking about going forward, I think you're going to have a very I think it's an issue to be very hard to move forward, to regulate in Texas anyway, to regulate in any 3 of those arenas. But who gets those weapons is the area that I think we should probably focus on the most. And I think it's the one that Representative White even mentioned it when he was making his remarks, is the arena I think you might have some consensus to do something about in Texas.
And how Representative Moody, would you get to the question of who gets them? Does it have to do with background checks?
Well, we talked about background checks, but when you talk about mental health, as Derek mentioned, it's a checkbox. That's self-policing. Now, you don't want to stigmatize mental health either. So, there's a very delicate issue there, too. Just because someone took a Zoloft 10 years ago, do you want to prohibit them from exercising what is a constitutional right? No, but do you want to prohibit someone that maybe is going to have violent tendencies or maybe should not have access to a weapon to have it, then yes. But again, that's legal gun ownership. Right. The larger issue is illegal gun ownership, and how do we crack down on that? Because those are the types of criminals that obviously aren't going through that system.
I want to come to Mr. Smith, but Representative White, do you take issue with anything Representative Moody just said as it relates to possibly figuring out who should and should not have guns, and whether from a public policy standpoint we can get involved in that conversation?
Well, I think we do that to a certain extent now. We have a national mental health registry. I'm told that is authenticated when you against other lists that deal with criminality, when you purchase a weapon. In Texas, we have this concealed handgun license, which you have this enhanced background check. I don't like doing this because I have a lot of respect for the office of the presidency, but I take issue with the president, running up to the mic in the midst of the drama and the grieving of this issue and politicizing it. Again, when we look at these, especially the spectacular mass shootings, so to speak, I think we need to really look at what is the issue. I believe my colleague sort of addresses it. When I look at these spectacular shootings, I'm looking at mental health. I'm looking at individuals that have criminal backgrounds that they would never get a weapon legally. And on this issue of campus carry, we have campus shootings around this country now, in many instances where concealed handgun license holders are not allowed to have their weapons on campus. So when you look at this scientifically, there's no correlation or causation.
So, in fact, an event like the one in Oregon, which was on a college campus, after all, makes you think that had people been armed and in a position to defend themselves.
Well, that's not for me to evaluate.
Right.
The question is the way you phrase the question, Evan.
The phrasing of the question, Representative.
Yes. Should, in Texas, should law-abiding citizens that have completed what we asked them to do as far as a concealed handgun license, should they have the discretion to carry their weapons on campus, inside the building?
Campus building.
Yes, so that's really the question.
Yeah, I want to get Mr. Smith in here. Mr. Smith, let me and I'll come back to Representative Moody because I want to pick up this campus carry question. Representative Smith, Representative White said that the president is politicizing. Mr. Smith, Representative White said, I've elected you apparently. Mr. Smith, Representative White is suggesting that somehow this issue is being politicized. Seems like it's been pretty political for a long time. This isn't the first instance of this issue being politicized.
Well, certainly not. I mean, I think that when an issue of this gravity gets that level of press, it invariably is going to be politicized. We have to be talking about it. But I think that what Derek said is also true. We're looking at it as an epidemic, and oftentimes missing sort of the larger picture. I'm the only. I'm not saying this cavalierly. I'm the only person on this panel who cannot carry a handgun or a rifle. Cannot be in the same car with one. Can't have one in my house. And I believe that that's a very, very good thing. Yes, because I do have a history of losing control of my actions. I'm doing much better now. But I want to emphasize that in so many of these instances, the individual who's engaged in these mass shootings, mass murders, that they've had some sort of intersect with the mental health system, or there were warning signs that made this person very much appropriate for mental health intervention. And it's important to remember that, at least in Texas, that it's very, very difficult to access mental health care. Oftentimes you're waiting 30, 45 days just to get an appointment. And if you aren't in some sort of priority population, one of the big 3 diagnoses, then it's not likely that you're going to get mental health care at all. And yet the individual is demonstrating warning signs that require some sort of third party to intervene and help this individual. So, to the extent that we can address it before it gets to that point is really important. But I also think that framing the mass murders as the epidemic also misses the point. The epidemic is in suicide. Most people who use handguns or own handguns might be more likely to suicide, or more likely to homicide, but that's more localized. To believe that we have this epidemic of violence in this country, it's more localized. In fact, crime rates are coming down. Violent crime rates are coming down. And I believe Derek covered that.
Representative Moody, mental health has come up a lot, up and down this panel so far. Mental health is a criminal justice issue, or so it appears to be. If you listen to people talk about how so many of the county jails have become the de facto mental health facilities around our state, this was something that we heard a little bit about in the aftermath of the Sandra Bland incident, but clearly it was not limited just to that. Why have we not done a better job of addressing this issue as it relates to the criminal justice component?
Well, overall, we've done a poor job of funding health care in the state. So it's just a subset of that.
I was under the impression from some of your colleagues that you all had actually done a little bit better in the last 2 sessions on mental health than you had previously.
It's increased,
but just not enough.
Well, when the bar's so low, I think it makes anything look like a success. But if you ask anyone, it draws laughs, but I mean, we have done very poorly for a very long time. And when you look at, take my experiences back from El Paso, where we have a large military population, where there are significant mental health resources that are needed when you have folks coming out of the military and some of the things that they've gone through, and they can't get the services through the federal system. They rely on your systems within the county, and they're just not there. And so we're failing people on a whole lot of levels, and it's not a surprise that you're going to continue to see these things on the rise. So if we don't do things better, and I remember first meeting with the governor, one of the first meetings with some of the legislators, the governor last session, that was Governor Perry brought up mental health and something we need to do better about, something we need to focus on. Governor Abbott's kind of followed in that message. So we need to emphasize that if they're willing to communicate about it and try to legislatively put it as a priority, then I think people on my side of the aisle obviously have been talking about this for a long time. So we need to gather that bipartisanship, which is rare, when you have that much momentum behind an issue, and really try to fix this to whatever extent that we can.
Mr. Cohen, this Representative Moody is exactly right. That there is a bipartisan agreement around the idea that there are mental health issues that tie back to the criminal justice system, and that in fact one way in which the left and the right can come together on this issue, as they can on very few others, is to emphasize the degree to which you can address that part of it. Right? There's general agreement about that.
Certainly, Evan. And I think the only thing I would actually add to that comment is how would we, the discussion of how we would go about doing it. We had a similar, we had a program at the Texas Public Policy Foundation about 2 weeks ago on this very issue. We had a representative from CPPP who's, their solution for this particular issue is Medicaid expansion. And while there would be certain people that find themselves in jail that would be affected by Medicaid expansion, we're talking, if we're looking at, I think the most recent report I've seen is 14 to 18% of people in jails are there for some sort of manifestation of an acute mental illness. If we're talking about that as 14 to 18%, that is not a great deal of offenders to justify this entire thing that would basically bankrupt the state. So I think that where we should be looking at mental health in Texas, especially where it's in its confluence with the criminal justice system, we need to look at a lot of what we've done on our side, on the criminal justice side, to make it more efficient. If you look at the mental health under just dishes generally, you see some just rampant inefficiencies. You see massive siloing of services, very little integration between the different service providers. All this has deadweight loss costs. All this has money basically evaporating out of the public coffers because they're not being spent towards any end. They're being spent redundantly. There are a lot of things that we can do currently with the amount of money appropriated now that would really move the needle more so than just a blanket Medicaid expansion on that point.
Representative White, let me stay with the Bland case. And so there were a lot of things that came out of the Sandra Bland tragedy that we've been discussing for it's had a long tail, right? Last couple of months. This question of mental health and jail suicides, sort of stark to realize that Ms. Bland was the 140th jail suicide in Texas jails since 2009. That's a lot of suicides.
A lot of those suicides.
A third of jailhouse deaths in Texas have been suicides. Many of those related back to mental health stuff. Jail standards. That's obviously become a legislative issue in the interim. There have been hearings, in fact, around the question of jail standards, whether the intake form at many of these facilities should be revised to provide better information in advance of some awful end. What is your takeaway as it relates to criminal justice policy in Texas from the Bland case specifically? Big national spotlight shined on our state. How can we do better for the next 5 years as a result of what we learned?
Well, first, we still need to continue to display compassion and thoughtfulness and prayers to the family as they still go through this period of reflection, which they still are going. Obviously, this issue happened at a place that's really close to me, my alma mater, Prairie View A&M University. It's a place where we often say Prairie View produces productive people, and not productive people for jails and prisons and to end up expiring there. With that said, in our system of government, our government has a constitutional mandate, not just a responsibility, but a mandate to protect those in custody. I think it's very alarming when I read various reports and up to 7 out of 10 of the people in any type of county or municipal jail setting hasn't been charged or they're innocent. Yet we have 149 deaths. So what I think we need to look at going the next 5 years, if not the next session, is how do we effectively address pretrial services? I believe Ms. Bland had self-checked that she probably had some intersection with mental health. But A couple of days later, she is dead in her jail cell. So more effective pretrial services where we identify the intersections, may they be physical health, mental health, and also getting people in front of attorneys where they can have their rightful day in court at in an expedient way as the system is supposed to work.
So,
yes,
so the Corrections Committee will take up some of these issues in the next session?
I think a whole lot of committees need to take this up.
Not just Corrections.
I think County Affairs, I've served on that committee before.
Yeah.
Criminal jurisprudence, corrections, the entire gamut.
Yeah.
We need to take this up. I think 149 people dying in the custody of government is too high.
Yeah. Mr. Smith, what do you say about the Bland case and the takeaways from a criminal justice policy standpoint for this state?
I think Rep. White stated it very accurately. A lot of these people are putting people in jail, and they're waiting, I believe about 60 to 75% of people in our county jails are there pre-trial. And a lot of them for misdemeanor cases, a lot of them just aren't, it's just not necessary for them to be there. So, and oftentimes the only reason that they are kept there is because they cannot afford the bond given them. The county hasn't established a pretrial system and deem that person eligible for PR bonds. When you look at individuals who are released on PR bonds, whether they be moderate risk or lower risk, they are just as likely to show up for their trial, and they're just as likely not to reoffend during that time that they're waiting for trial. So the fact that they're sitting there waiting, it's driving up jail costs, and it's straining their resources that could be used to actually adequately address the mental health needs of individuals who are inside of the county jail.
Mr. Cohen, you have any problem with that?
No, actually, I would agree with Mr. Smith wholeheartedly. I think that our current bond system, as it is set up, is completely risk agnostic, which is, that is what it is essentially for. It is supposed to be a screen for if somebody represents a persistent danger to the community that they're not able to get out and affect that harm. There is nothing criminogenic about not having $500. It has nothing to do with whether or not someone has a propensity to reoffend. I think that casts a larger. That's another issue that probably deserves more conversation on here in the different in the different solutions for that. But referring to the Sandra Bland case, just on the screening component alone, there is something that can be done in one fell swoop that would clean up so much of this trouble. What we have is we don't have sheriffs who are running the jails with the capacity to be able to make a quality informed assessment on whether or not somebody is in an acute mental health crisis, if they are suffering from a more chronic mental illness. They are not able to make that determination. The only people locally that would be able to do that are, say, like the LMHAs, the local mental health authorities. In so many cases, LMHAs are more likely to be focusing on very high needs individuals, people that aren't necessarily in jail, but people that are kind of making up the big three, as it were. If they had a more diverse portfolio and were made to actually interact with the sheriffs, I mean, it's oftentimes that a sheriff will say to the LMHA, we have a person here, they check the box, not sure what to do, can you come in for a diagnosis? They go, well, we're kind of busy talking somebody off of a bridge right now. Would you like us to walk away from this to go do that? Right. And that's how people end up falling through the cracks.
Right. Mr. Moody, better coordination might make a difference.
I can't disagree with anything that's been said about how we failed Sandra Bland once she was booked into that county jail. It needs to be fixed. Something that's unacceptable. Something that has been missed in this discussion is she should have never been in the jail to begin with. And that's something that really that is something that needs to be looked at. As a former prosecutor, I've watched the tape as everyone else I'm sure has. There's no reason to remove her from that vehicle. Can you arrest someone for a traffic offense? Absolutely. Is it done in Texas? Sure. It is extremely rare to do.
Do you believe, a lot has been made of Ms. Bland's race and the question of race in policing, not just in Texas, but we seem to be in a national conversation about race and policing. Are you saying that you believe Ms. Bland's race was the reason that she was arrested?
I think there were a lot of factors. I think race is one of them. in that instance. If you look at the data, and the Texas Tribune ran a fairly extensive piece on it, looking at citation data from DPS.
Right. Non-Anglos tend to be subjected to traffic stops at a higher rate than Anglos.
And larger than their population percentages. And if you look at the arrest data within that, it's skewed even higher. So those that are arrested for those traffic citations are even more representative. So that there is something going on there.
Right.
Okay. And the answer that we got, at least that they gave to Texas Tribune, it was we don't really have an answer to why this is happening. That's not good enough. In light of all these circumstances, in my opinion, that's not good enough.
Representative White, do we have a problem with race and policing in this state that we need to address over the next 5 years?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily what I think. I think it's what the people think. And across the board, people believe that. This is, listening to the last few comments, I think we start from this basic point, Evan. Whenever the criminal justice system intersects with any citizen, that is a serious issue. Now, let me just give you a little anecdotal story, just real quick. I worked with Senator Whitmire this past session on this truancy legislation, and we decriminalized that offense on juveniles. So I've got a lot of calls from school superintendents, school teachers, you call these other folks, judicial, municipal judges, justices of the peace, definitely having their take on that. And they didn't like it. A lot of them didn't like it. I was talking.
They wanted the current criminalization of truancy to remain in effect.
Absolutely, sir. And so I was talking with one local judge, a judge that has judicial power of a local entity, and I said, "Well, Judge, what would you like back?" He said, "I would like to have the discretion to confine on these contempt orders dealing with truancy cases." I said, "Well, I'm going to tell you this. You're not going to get that. Well, I'm not going to support that." But then I asked him this. If that kid dies in custody in a municipal or county jail, what do you say tomorrow morning on the news when they ask you, why was the young person there? Well, because he was missing school and he didn't follow one of my orders. And now he's lying there dead. And the judge looked at me stone-faced. That's just unacceptable. And I think my colleague has a point where when we decide that the criminal justice system needs to intersect with our citizens, it is a serious issue and it should be taken very seriously.
And you think that the criminal justice system intersecting with our citizens should be a last resort, not a first resort?
Well, obviously, because the purpose of the criminal justice system, by maintaining safe communities, is to punish the wrongdoer, thereby protecting our life and our property.
Right. Let me turn this around a little bit, Mr. Smith. There's a big conversation within the criminal justice policy realm about fewer people incarcerated, whether it relates to mandatory minimums and sentencing reform, whether it relates to the size of the prison population overall. My colleague Jolie McCullough is here, who did an analysis of the prison population in Texas a few weeks ago and found that the prison population in Texas in the 2013-2014 year had dropped by 1.3%, and that since 2010 it had dropped by 4.4%. And I gather that you, among others, believe that this is a significant statistical finding, that the prison population is dropping. Is this a good thing? Does it necessarily mean that we're safer as a state, or does it mean that finally the policy arena is catching up with where it should be as it relates to incarceration?
Well, there's lots of questions there.
There are. You go at this however you want.
Okay, so the prison population is down a few percentage points. Let's remember that it increased 200% since the early 1990s, 200%. It's a staggering number. It should make you dizzy. It's nearly 150,000 people. I believe there are 148 right now. Yes,
and we have the largest prison population of any state in the country.
We do.
Yes.
We do. We have the largest. Our incarceration rate is in the top 5, and in terms of sheer numbers, it's number 1. And yes, so it is absolutely significant. It's significant on two levels. It's significant that it's come down at all because they were projected to grow. They were projected to build more units in about 2007. So that is significant. It's also significant that it hasn't continued to grow, or that we haven't reversed these gains that we've made. So that is significant.
What's the message of that? What is the takeaway from the fact that our population, prison population, has declined by more than 4% in the last 5 years?
Well, for me, the takeaway is that we could easily go backwards. We are right at the crossroads. We are right at a turning point. We can either go back to building more prisons, or we can continue to make progress. And that takes all of us agreeing that this is not an effective use of dollars, that people with mental illness are over-incarcerated, that people of color are over-incarcerated, and that we're putting people in prison. We used to put people in prison when all of our interventions had failed and this person remained a danger to society. Now we put people in prison that we're angry at, that we just can't, we haven't found an appropriate intervention. They continue to relapse, or they continue to have manifestations of mental illness. These are the people we're incarcerating now. We've gone way overboard, and until we have agreement that there are more effective interventions, at which there are, in order to deal with criminal justice, then we stand the likelihood of building more prisons. We think, our particular organization believes that we could achieve with agreement a 30% reduction, which would be appropriate.
Mr. Moody, do you believe a 30% reduction anytime soon in the prison population is possible, and is it desirable?
You would, I mean, you have to take two different approaches, I would say, to get there, or one of two different approaches. You probably do want to get what you consider felony drug offenders, those maybe without violent history, out of the prison system. Those are folks that maybe you can track back into society in a productive way. I think that's the population that most people are talking about. Figuring out how to fix that within criminal justice. We took a small stab at it on the local level when you look at decriminalizing possession of small amounts of marijuana. Now that's it's a local tax cost. That's going to be something that's going to save at the smaller level, but you have a huge amount of the people we talked about sitting in those county jails. Those are the types of people sitting in those county jails.
But the legislature attempted to run a version of that play this session and did not succeed.
It had bipartisan support, didn't ultimately get on the floor for a full vote, but I don't think that's not slowing down. There's a momentum behind an effort to do something like that. The bigger effort on the felony level, we penalize by weight. So when you look at drug offenses, we look at weight. We need to look at maybe the state jail system. What weight categories do we put there? We have pretty broad categories now when it comes to marijuana. Do we want to siphon some of that down to the misdemeanor level? You're going to take people out of state jails. Do you want to ratchet stuff down from the felony level and push it down? Those are ways you can start to reduce prison population, or you can maybe get rid of the habitualization of repeat felons when it comes to certain drug offenses. If they have 2 strikes against them and those were also drug offenses, maybe you don't give them the 25 years minimum. Maybe there's a way to create a construct there, and that's something that I've been starting to work on during this interim. If you want to take a large swing at that, those are the ways to do it.
Does it get back to what Representative White referred to as discretion on the part of our judges, giving judges the opportunity to, because the mandatory minimums have been essentially handcuffs around our judges for some time. The sentencing policies of a lot of communities have been dictated to them, but not every case and not every potential felon or offender is created equal.
No, I think that's a great point. And having been in the courtroom as a prosecutor, you don't want to be tied with something like that, especially in a situation where you don't see the facts that bear it out.
Right.
But a lot of times you are, and so those are the types of things you have to address. And if you start to decouple, maybe it is a dangerous area to wade into, because you're going to have the exception to that rule. You're going to have someone that is a violent offender that you are going to want to punish in that way, and it's not going to be an option to you at that point. My sense of things, having been in an office doing that, is that if someone is involved in criminal activity and engaged in that level, there are a lot of tools in the tool belt to be able to pop them if you need to. Right. And so maybe we need to start reducing some of the other ones.
Mr. Cohen, from the grassroots conservative perspective, and the grassroots conservative perspective does drive much of our political and policy discussion in Texas these days, are you cool with the idea of relooking at mandatory minimums and sentencing reform and possibly decriminalization of the sort that Mr. Moody's talking about?
Well, to be honest with you, I can't speak for every single one of those provisions, and that was several questions packed there. And mandatory minimums, though, I definitely think mandatory minimums that should be looked at. Any sort of minimums, any sort of minimum enhancement to a penalty should actually be questioned for the very reason the representative just pointed out. It is a handcuff on the judges. We have individuals in the judicial system who have spent their entire lives doing just this, but instead we defer to, I believe George Will called it moral exhibitionism that we would get from either Washington or Austin. And I think that kind of really separates the will of, we'll say, Harris County from what might be the aggregate of the state. And I mentioned Harris County specifically because they do have a low-level diversion program, especially for first-time offenders. I mean, it's not uncommon for these larger city district attorneys to simply take a pass on prosecuting low-level offenders simply because it is so time-consuming, it's so inefficient to do so, and to we use that much ink, use that much paper just for one person caught with, say, a joint, is an inefficient use of resources. Now, you asked earlier about the reduction of prison populations. Is the reduction of 4%, is that significant? I would say, per se, no, it's not. The simple movement in a percentage of prison population doesn't mean anything in and of itself. Look at California. Very short time period. They cut their prison population 25%. And they did it because the Supreme Court told them to, because they were at 200% capacity. Now, I would not look at the realignment model under AB 109 in California and say that's a model that any state should replicate. I looked at these static risk factors that have been shown to not be very predictive of criminal behavior, and said everyone below this cut point gets forced down to the counties, and of course similarly in the counties, if we're running out of space there, we're forcing people out on probation. So what that is a very risk agnostic way of approaching this that does not portend well for public safety.
Does the question of sentencing, don't want to get all Rand Paul on you here, but does the question of sentencing reform and mandatory minimums and all that have a racial component itself? We actually heard briefly, while Rand Paul was a plausible presidential candidate, we heard a lot about how the criminal justice system was somehow keeping non-white offenders locked up disproportionately, and that somehow we had to get back to a time where we treated the entire population from a criminal justice standpoint the same, in his belief, and not only his belief. We're not. Representative White, what do you think?
Well, I think there's something there to that. I mean, at least the last four presidents, they've all admitted that they have indulged in some type of intoxicant, so they get they do this mea culpa.
It was a very gentle way that you said that.
Yeah. Well. So what happens, Evan, is they admit it on the campaign trail. Everybody thinks they're just a normal person. They get elected to the White House. After the White House, they write a book. If you are a poor white, rural white, or you're African American, you get caught with a small amount of marijuana. Well,
you don't go to the White House.
You go to the courthouse and they throw the book at you. Right. So you kind of wonder: is this about criminal justice, or is it about just who gets caught? But when you look at this, Evan, when you're in the criminal justice policy arena, often we kind of silo, because that's what we do in the legislature. We have all these committees. But you need to be concerned about everything. The three biggest budget items: education, medication, and then incarceration. If you probably fail on the first two, you're going to end up with incarceration. So having a strong education system, a prosperous economy, it doesn't make any sense, and I'll get partisan and political here, it doesn't make any sense to spend monies in TDCJ training inmates to do welding and these sort of things, and then you can't get the Keystone Pipeline renewed, or there's some regulation coming down from the feds or the states that impact the economy and pretty much put certain jobs obsolete. So it has to be the whole package. It has to be education. It has to be the economy. You got to have a prosperous state, so you don't have these urgings to get into the criminal situation.
Mr. Moody, let me ask the question straight away. Are we locking up too many black and brown people in the state of Texas and not in the state of Texas?
Yeah, I think there's an absolute disparity. I mean, Representative White highlighted is one. I think, and then you got in the Keystone Pipeline, so I had to detach from what you said. But how does that get into every conversation? No. But no. Actually, the point that you brought up is poverty and criminal justice. Poor people do worse in the criminal justice system. Why? And you heard it during this conversation. If you're in the county jail, you can't afford the bond, you're going to plead guilty. You're a 17-year-old kid with what was left of a joint, and you're in the county jail, you can't make whatever the bond is, you're going to plead guilty to that. Guess what that just did to you for the rest of your life? That has tracked you out of job opportunities.
So it's as much about class as it is race.
I think so, absolutely. I think your outcome in that environment is worse off if you are poor coming into it.
So again, you and Representative White are 2 of 181 in the legislature. You have the ability to change policy or to affect the conversation in that building. Look ahead 5 years. How do you make class less of a factor from a criminal justice standpoint?
He hit it on the head, education. And I look forward to him helping me increase those funds to public education here in Texas as we go forward. We're failing. We're failing the future of Texas by not doing a good job in our education. And it's not a snap fix. It is something that's institutional and must take place over time. But the statistics don't lie. Your educational attainment bears on whether you're going to have interaction with the criminal justice system.
It correlates to
but on top of that education, you need to have a growing economy that creates the jobs and the revenues for government to be able to do education and do all these other great things. So again, it's one thing to tell the TDCJ and to have all of these trade learning opportunities inside the walls. But if we have all of these regulations and we have a situation where we're handcuffing our economy where it cannot create the prosperity and the jobs, then we'll just be sitting here 5 years later talking about the next 5 years.
We're going to go to audience questions here shortly. Mr. Smith, we're in Huntsville. We are obligated by journalism, if not by law, to talk about the death penalty. Texas is famously the killingest state in the country as it relates to capital punishment. That's not a positive or a negative. It's not pejorative. It's not a brag. It is what it is. We have put more people to death in Texas than any place else, and we still do. Tonight, in this very city, the 11th Texan, or the 11th person in Texas, I should say, will be put to death. There are 3 more soon to come. The number of people who we put to death is down, but it's not 0. It's still the number 1 in the whole country. We don't hear much about the death penalty anymore. Why is that? And as we look ahead 5 years in Texas, will the conversation about capital punishment in this state and not in this state be any different, and should it be different?
It's somewhat personal to me. Do you mind if I just answer it? Okay. So I was incarcerated for 5 years and 8 months, 3 blocks from here at that unit down the street, and used to look up the hill and wonder if ever might take a class here in the criminal justice building and be part of conversations like this. That's the unit in Texas where they do executions, sometimes twice a week. I was a trustee, so at the back gate you got to see the hearse go by with the individual inside. I was incarcerated with individuals who had committed similar offenses, and because of disparities in our justice system, some people get life and some people get death. And the individuals who get life, at least the ones with whom I was incarcerated, oftentimes play a pivotal role in the rehabilitation of individuals. I can't understate that. Some of the biggest mentors to me were people who had destroyed their own lives and destroyed the lives of other people, but had committed themselves to living a different type of life. They act as mentors. They oftentimes lead groups, run programs, things of that nature. They're upstanding citizens because oftentimes they age out of the type of impulsive criminal behavior that led them into the criminal justice system in the first place. So to have a policy that precludes that from happening is very difficult to live with, perhaps particularly when you've seen the corpse. So,
you're with the Nebraska Legislature, which and Nebraska is not Moscow. Let's acknowledge. Nebraska is a conservative state. The Nebraska Legislature this year voted to ban the death penalty. Governor vetoed it. The legislature conservative legislature overrode the governor's veto. This conversation is beginning to pop up in unlikely places. So your position is, from a 5-year perspective, we ought to be moving toward an elimination of this policy.
I think we should continue to have the conversation. I can't.
Right. Mr. Cohen, is there any sympathy on the conservative end of the policy spectrum for what Mr. Smith is proposing?
Certainly, and I wouldn't say that Mr. Smith is proposing it. I think that he understands how serious and nuanced this issue is. TPPF does not have a view on the death penalty simply because there is such a broad spectrum of opinion on the topic in the conservative and libertarian movements to begin with. I mean, there is no right answer on what is fundamentally a very, very salient moral question.
Is it working from a policy standpoint for Texas right now?
As defined how?
Well, from a criminal justice standpoint, is the capital punishment system in Texas accomplishing its ends?
Which is?
You tell me. I just work here.
Fair enough. I think the way to look at this, and I mean this completely in the abstract, is that the capital punishment writ large, as a philosophical construct, is a retributive punishment demonstrating the moral opprobrium of incredibly heinous criminal activities. Whether or not you feel that should beget one punishment or another is based on subjective criteria that I don't think I have the expertise or even philosophical underpinnings to answer.
You're agnostic about it.
Yes.
Are you, Representative White? Is the system that we are associated with in the nation's mind the right one for us, and do we need a change in the next 5 years?
Well, I would say, if you are, well, let me just begin here. Our Constitution, at least by rulings of the Supreme Court, stated that the death penalty is constitutional. With that said, the death penalty is a punishment, and that's it. It's a punishment. I don't think that it discourages people from, I don't think it's a deterrent. It's a punishment. I know I have an opportunity to kind of have a little personal contact with this situation. I'll go ahead and take this liberty to say, if not the only one, I think I'm one of 2 or 3 members of the legislature that's come here to Huntsville and kind of looked at the entire process to include the actual execution. And then on the other end, when I go back home, I know there's at least one family in Jasper. They're relatives of James Byrd, and they will occasionally ask me, when will those offenders meet the punishment that the jury in Jasper assigned to them. So it's a punishment.
Mr. Moody, word on the death penalty, please, and for the next 5 years, how we should think about it, and then we're going to go to audience questions.
I think it's been encapsulated how difficult a topic this is, and we have a hearing about it every session. And since the first session I sat in the legislature, I was 27 years old, and I met a gentleman who was on death row, who was exonerated, who was not guilty of the crime, legally not guilty of the crime that he was sent to death row for. That is a conversation that is necessary for people in the legislature making these policy decisions. If we have a system that can have those types of errors, what do we need to do? Are there safeguards that can prevent those things, or should we not exact the ultimate punishment because it is a human system after all? But then I'm telling you, I've had many conversations with my dad about this. He was a district judge. He was a first assistant DA in El Paso. He has prosecuted people, sent them to the death penalty. He has signed off on death warrants himself. It is a difficult conversation to have because the heinous nature of the crimes that people are convicted of and the victims that have gone through that and their families, sometimes that's a safety valve for the society. You can't be here anymore. And that's the way I always kind of viewed it. It's a safety valve.
You believe that's a legitimate way to view it?
I think that's the way that's the way I viewed it, and that's the way that I think a lot of people view it, as something that's, like Representative White said, it's a punishment. There is no general deterrence. There is specific deterrence. That individual is never going to commit another crime in the rest of their life. They're done. There is something for the family, but there are many families who have gone through that process and said, I don't want this. I forgive this person, and that's what I'm here to do. And so it is a continuing conversation. I don't think it's going away. I think ultimately in my lifetime you'll see the death penalty come to an end in the United States. I don't think it's going to happen in the next 5 years in Texas, but I think that's something that I think ultimately that's where we're going.
Let's bring the audience for the balance of our time into the conversation. We've gone a little bit longer on our end. We might cheat a minute or two longer on your end. If you have questions, raise your hand. We do have a microphone. Well, we're going to ask that you use your outside voice. And I will repeat the question for the benefit of people here and people on the live stream if you ask it. Sir.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for speaking with us today. I listened to an awful lot of what you said, but I've noticed it seems like 95% of people get indicted, get convicted, and yet when we look at certain things that have happened in Texas and Dallas, it's clear that an awful lot of those people are convicted should never have been convicted. And I think the number's bigger than we're thinking about.
Okay.
And what is the comment we have about the absolute unbridled power of prosecutors to selectively prosecute either political opponents or people they don't like or things of that nature? There doesn't seem to be any governance whatsoever.
Okay, let's talk about that. Do we have an innocence problem? You know, on the death penalty question over the last 10 to 15 years, question of reference Dallas County specifically, there have been a lot of instances of people in Dallas County who had been prosecuted and convicted who were found not to have committed those crimes. Michael Morton and Anthony Graves are two of the poster children for the innocence movement in this state. Is the questioner's point legitimate, that the prosecutorial system may be a little bit off base here from an innocence standpoint? Mr. Moody.
There's failures across the system when you look at those cases, and I know that Representative McClendon from San Antonio is very proud that over the next few months we're going to be looking at all those cases and doing a diagram and kind of breaking them down from start to finish. She passed a bill that she'd been working on for years to look at those exonerees in their cases. Where were the failings? Sometimes the failings were on their defense counsel. And that's not people need to look at that point. When you talk about poverty in the criminal justice system, are there attorneys representing them well?
Inadequate counsel for those.
It's always an issue that's raised. The prosecutor, I think the question was going towards maybe the grand jury system, and maybe there was grand jury reform passed this session that took away the key man system. I don't know. I mean, the grand jury system is an old system. What's the solution if you take the decision away from a grand jury? Ostensibly, then it falls directly into the hands of the prosecuting attorney. I don't know how that's all. If you think the problem is the prosecutor is directing the grand jury what to do, if you eliminate the grand jury system, it's all on their table. Now, maybe that's the way to do it. You hold them accountable. They make decisions, and they either indict or they don't. The grand jury was seen as a protection. But
Representative White, is there something that you all in the Pink Building can do to address this concern about whether people who are innocent are being sent away?
Well, obviously there's something we can do, but, you know, I have 5 counties, 5 district attorneys. They all stand for election just like I do. I get these questions often. Matter of fact, before I walked in here, some constituent called me about some DA going after his girlfriend. But then I look at, just like you said, 95% indictment rate, I believe, or conviction rate. I look at these DA elections, and they're 65, 70%. They win. So I would urge the voters also to use their discretion and address this issue.
Questions from our audience? Sir, and then ma'am.
We tend to have a problem with our criminal justice system as far as integration between public mental health services, county jails, and even our prison system. When a person enters one of these systems, their pharmaceutical protocol switches up a lot of times. A lot of times inmates, offenders may go off their medications for months at a time until that's corrected. What do y'all see in the future as far as integrating services under our DHS, our county jails, and our state prison system to address some of these integration problems?
Well, Mr. Cohen, in fact, alluded to somehow better coordination between law enforcement and the local mental health authorities, right? That might be one way.
And certainly, and I think that a big point that brings up, though, is discontinuity of medication, and it could be especially when you have an individual who has been stabilized through medication. If they just go cold turkey, and pardon my crassness, there's really no other way to put it. If they just go cold turkey on their medication, that leads to very, very serious withdrawal symptoms in many cases. And when that actually manifests itself, it might seem like an in-facility behavioral issue, when it's really an actual pharmacological reaction, or should I say, not reaction, withdrawal symptom. And I think that, yes, the LMHAs might be able to help in that regards, but I think the check here, and this has been alluded to in some of the hearings we've seen already post-Sandra Bland, is that we simply need to have a system that if you have a valid prescribed medication, that you are able to continue taking it, even with a supply provided by the individual's family, uninterrupted. I don't think that's too much to ask.
But that would require, Mr. Smith, on the part of these facilities a little bit more involvement in. It's almost like they become medical facilities as well as criminal justice facilities, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it goes back to our point before. These are not mental health facilities. We're trying to turn them into them, and we can try, but there are more appropriate places to treat someone who is having a active mental health crisis. In fact, you're 8 times more likely to be in jail during that crisis than you are in some sort of psychiatric facility. I'm not suggesting that we rebuild psychiatric hospitals, but we do need to acknowledge that and somehow keep some sort of coordination between the mental health centers, and there's got to be a better way. And I think that would be a good conversation to have in the next 5 years, is what's a good alternative for someone who is in mental health crisis. One of the things that I mentioned during one of the hearings on the Sandra Bland case is that oftentimes people are honest on that mental health assessment. When they go into a county jail, they'll be honest about suicide history and things of that nature. And the problem with being honest, and I'll tell you this from personal experience, is that that's not going to trigger any sort of mental health care at that point. What's going to happen is that you're oftentimes going to be stripped and put into a rubber room or an isolation cell. In some counties, you might actually be strapped to a chair and held there for hours. There has to be a way. If our answer to improving jail standards, improving mental health care inside of jails, is to find out if they might be at risk and then put them in isolation, then we are truly off base. We need to acknowledge these are not places to receive mental health care.
Woman in the front had a question, and then we'll stay as long as we can. But I don't want to.
Actually, has there been any thought for the education program? This is more than 5 years. This is 10, 15 years.
Yep.
But to go in and teach children coping skills, because a lot of times, even at home, they have a rough home life. Therefore, they end up being criminals because of their home life. If we taught them coping skills young, then maybe we could teach them to cope at home, and then cope when they're in a stressful situation, and then hopefully free up our mental health facilities for those that truly.
Mr. Moody, anything we can be doing on this?
I don't know if we dictate anything specific in curriculum. I think maybe some of that is should be inherent in our system, our education system. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. My mother was an educator for 30 years, and the problems that come from home walk in the classroom, and that those are the things that you're placed in your responsibility. And sometimes those situations are extremely difficult. So those are, but if we're not giving them the tools that they're able to help out with, our counselors at our schools, if they're making sure that we give them those abilities as well, maybe we can start to change things on a wider level, like a more broader approach. Like you said, this isn't. Unfortunately, everybody wants an overnight fix to some of these problems. It's not. It's something it's broader. It's societal.
I'm afraid we're going to lose people with the time changing over to 1 o'clock, so I'm going to just, with respect to the people who have their hands up, I'm going to call it there. Perhaps if you want to come up and visit privately and ask a question of one of our panelists. It's been a terrific conversation, very substantive, covered a lot of ground. We're so fortunate to have had them here. Please thank Derek Cohen, Joe Moody, Douglas Smith, and James White. Thank you again to the Texas, to our friends here at Sam Houston State and the Texas State System, and thanks to all of you for coming. We appreciate it. Thanks.